Okay. Lecture 16. And this lecture is, it might be a bit echoey. Is it a bit echoey? Might be. Anyway, lecture 16. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about inequality, income inequality, wealth inequality, but also inequality of opportunity. And I think that that's an important one because it undermines or underpins the previous two. But specifically, we're talking about inequality in this lecture. And what I want you to take away from it, in terms of learning outcomes, is that I would like you to be able to understand and appreciate the dynamics of wealth and income inequality. In other words, how it's made up and how it's come to be. I would also like you to appreciate the contemporary narratives that justify the status quo. And those narratives are concerned with the importance of finance and the importance of the tech world and the innovations within. And then consider the limitations of in the of arguments that relate to technological advancement and also to financial deepening. And when we talk about financial deepening is the access to the widest possible group of people of finance. So deepening means deepening within the population. So another expression for it could be the democratization of finance as well. And both tech and financial deepening are predicated upon certain assumptions. And we need to explore those, and we need to think that we need to ask some questions about whether or not the assumptions hold true and whether or not the kinds of innovations that we're talking about here are bringing the results and the benefits that they are assumed to bring. Okay, so that's what I want you to take away from this lecture today. Just check the chat box there. Very good. Somebody's fixed their sound. If you can mute yourselves as well, that would be great. There's a few of you here, actually. Thank you. That's good. So, learning outcomes, that we've dealt with that one. Now, so when we're talking about inequality, what we're talking about is distributional problems within our economy or within our society more generally. So the income, wealth, and opportunity is not distributed equally, or is it? You know, so that's the question that we're talking about here. Now, I guess that you could suggest that there is a utopian element to this. Is it realistic or even feasible that both income, wealth, and opportunity can be distributed equitably within a particular society or an economy? Well, I mean, I think that they are legitimate questions, but the issue there is to what extent are inequalities acceptable? So, you know, and I'll raise that question as we go through it. You know, is it, if we see evidence of inequality, is that justifiable? I mean, you might say, well, it's inevitable, but to what extent is it justifiable or acceptable within a wider polity? So within that, therefore, there are a number of questions that we need to address. We need to think about how we measure income inequality. And there are a couple of ways in which we can do it, and I'm going to cover today. There is a third way of doing it as well, which is known as the Thiel index, but we're not going to cover that in this one. But if you're interested in this kind of stuff, you can research that on your own. But we can look at factors of production approach in GDP calculations. Is that, as you know, is that GDP is the aggregate of all goods and services created within an economy. But you can also look at national income and how national income is distributed. The GDP equates to national income, and you can look at how national income is distributed within an economy. And then there are what's known as Gini coefficients, which is a widely accepted measure of inequalities. And they are statistical measurements that range from 1 to 0. So 1 would be where you have maximum inequality. In other words, one or a very small group of people holds all of the income, down to zero, which means that equal income is distributed equally across everybody. And of course, within that, there's all sorts of different possibilities, isn't there? And then wealth inequality, we need to really think about the way that markets work in this. And we talk about our financialized economy and how the financialization itself is having an impact upon wealth and income distributions. And does it contribute to inequality? Is inequality, in fact, a natural consequence of a financialized economy? So we'll touch upon that. We'll touch upon the works of Thomas Piketty, which is one of the core readings for your exam as well. The first 10 pages of the introduction of Piketty's work on capital and ideology. But within an earlier work, Capital in the 21st Century in 2014, Piketty gives us the identity of R is greater than G, which is where the return on assets is greater than the growth of GDP. In other words, when the price of assets is going up higher than the GDP of a particular economy, is that Piketty would assert that inequality is an inevitability. And then we also need to think about what are the consequences of these inequalities. And their earlier work from people such as Kalecki and Polanyi would assert that inequalities within an economy gives political problems and social problems. And I think that to an extent, we've witnessed that within the UK in the last few years, is that to what extent was the Brexit vote in 2016 a response or as a consequence of inequalities or perceived unfairnesses within the economic system, which then brings about a degree of political unrest, which can lead to social unrest. And in the work that I referred to, which is your core reading, the Capital and Ideology, is that Piketty says that inequality is seen as a consequence of political choice. Now, that's quite a provocative statement. Now, whether or not inequality is inevitable with any particular society is Piketty's view, asserts that the extent of inequality is politically orientated. In other words, policymakers have a responsibility in order to try and ameliorate or to reduce levels of inequality within a society. Give everybody a fair crack of the whip, in other words. So going back to the first one then, which we talked about in the introductory slide, is that we said that there are two approaches to GDP. There's the expenditures and the output approach, and then there's the income and allocations approach, okay? And they are, certainly the one on the left-hand side there is an expression and identity that you'll be well familiar with because we've covered it more than once within the actual course. So GDP is the sum of consumption, investment, government purchases, and expenditures by the foreign element. But a way that you can also calculate GDP is through income, national income. National income equates to GDP, and that will be wages plus rents plus the interest plus profits. And then there's a statistical adjustment in order to ensure that it does meet the same number as the expenditures approach. But when you look at the income approach, and the way that income filters through the economic system, is that there is an imbalance, if you like, of who claims what. In the majority of people who earn their money through work, through labor, in other words, they gain an income, the part of the national income would be compensation for their work, so the compensation of employees. That's the labour share of the national income. The state share, which is at the bottom of the national income, would be taxes on production and imports, and then the bits in the middle is the share of income that would go to owners of capital: rents, interest, proprietors' income, corporate profits, which would include income taxes, dividends, and undistributed corporate profits. Corporate profits, a big part. Now, there's a distinction here between the types of income that are possible. One is where somebody gets paid as a fee for their labor income, and the other one where people get paid but they do no productive labor themselves, and that's the capital share of it, which is another word for it is rentier income. R-E-N-T-I-E-R. Rentier income is where an individual gets paid but does no productive work. So if you own a share and the share goes up, you've not done anything in terms of work in order to actually accelerate the price of that share. If you claim a rent from a property, whether it be commercial or residential, you don't do anything from month to month to month to earn the income in terms of productive work. Yeah, so there is a difference here between the kinds of incomes that people would hold. Capital share tends to be a rentier income where no productive work is done. Labor share is where there is recompense for labor for work done in the form of an income. But these flow through the system in different measures. And in our financialized economy that we've defined in earlier lectures, we can see that gross domestic product or national income can flow one of two ways. If you take out the state share, which tends to be outside of this particular the diagram itself, the state claims its money from other people's incomes. So gross domestic product or national income flows down, and it can go either to the capital, rentier share, or to the labor share. Now, in our financialized economy, is that the capital share, the percentage share of income going to capital is increasing, but the capital share going to labor is decreasing. On the labor share is that you can therefore split it again and say, well, where's that going? And of course, is that labor share, earned income, can go to either management and supervisors, or it can go to the non-management, the non-managerial worker share. And in aggregate, statistics are showing us, or accounts actually, are showing us that the non-managerial share is declining or is going down relative to the managerial share. In other words, managers are getting paid more, proportionately more money to income, to the non-management part of our sector. On the other side of the diagram is on the capital share. Profits are relatively declining relative to total national income, but the amount that's being paid to interest earning aspects of it, such as shares and dividends, is increasing. And in the profit element is that the financial sector's profits are growing relative to the non-financial sector's profits. So if you're a rentier that's holding shares within the financial profit sector, within the financial sector, is that you're likely to be doing particularly well. That's not completely across the, it's not a complete generalization, is it? Because we have seen that actually the tech sector is driving quite considerably stock markets across the world. So there is an element of question and balance that needs to be considered here as well. But, and I've shown you this one before, I think, is that, as we've said in earlier lectures, is that the gap between executive pay and average wage has been widening in the US. Yes, it's widening to a greater extent within the US, but it's not just the US, it's most of the developed economies across the globe. Okay, so CEOs are making 2000, and I think these figures are from 2018, so there'll be 2017 figures, is CEOs are making approximately 312 times more than typical workers, which is a considerable contributor to inequality of income, is that proportionately senior managers are making more relative to median incomes of the average worker. Further to that, though, is that when you look at the purchasing power of income for medium wage earners, is that US wages are larger there's more money, but actually when you actually consider the amount that you can buy with it, there's been hardly any growth at all in average income since, well, over the last 40 years, or medium income, I beg your pardon. So the amount goes up, but what you can buy with that amount is the same as it was back in the early 1970s. In other words, if you stripped out inflation, there's been hardly any increase in median wages for 40 plus years. Now, it's not quite as bad in Europe, but wages in the UK stagnated certainly since 2008. And I think I've mentioned these figures before, in that in the Thatcherite years, which would be, what would that be? Late 1970s to 1992, is that there were growth in average earnings were around about 18%. In the Blairite years, which would be 92 to 2008, there was growth in earnings of about 25%. But since 2008 to the current date, there's the growth in earnings is minus 2.4. So that accelerates inequalities too. Now, there is also this other conundrum that needs to be thought about here, and that's the effect of productivity, is that we are reliably told in the UK that we are suffering a productivity crisis. The idea being is that in order for firms to be able to maintain their profitabilities and therefore their returns to shareholders, is that the firm itself needs to become more productive, more efficient at generating profits. And then that way, those increased profits, or a proportion of those profits, can be passed on to the employer. And they will get, so without productivity gains, the employer stands to make, or the employee, I beg your pardon, stands to make no gains. But when you do look at the actual figures, is that there has been no link between productivity and income earning since the 1970s, the period of wage stagnation. In other words, productivity has accelerated since the 1970s, but the gains have not been passed on equitably to workers or to senior managers or to shareholders, to rents and interests and so on and so forth, or to accelerated pay to the senior management. So on that basis, therefore, it seems that calls for increased productivity are a little empty, when really what productivity has been demonstrated to do over the years is just exacerbate the size of corporate profits and the capacity to be able to pass those profits on through free cash flow to the shareholders, driving, of course, the shareholder phenomenon. And we've looked at profitability in other earlier lectures to say that what we've seen evidences of is super profitability, in that levels of profitability have remained the same or stable, or indeed have grown in certain parts of the world, whereas median incomes are flat and or declining in real terms. So let's move on to the Gini coefficient. As I say, the Gini coefficient is a way of statistically measuring inequalities between populations. And what the good news is that globally, between countries, income inequality has declined quite considerably. However, a little bit further deeper digging into these, these figures would show that the reason behind the decline of income inequality across the globe is by and large as a consequence of the growth of the middle classes in China. Milanovic did some extensive work and came up with something which is known as the elephant curve, which shows quite considerable growth in sort of the 30 to 60% of median or decile of income growth. And that he attributes to the growth of the middle classes in China, where some 400 million people have been moved from agrarian incomes and into middle class kinds of work, but middle class incomes, middle class being defined as a percentage above median income. Okay. So nevertheless, we just take that as being given, is that generally the statistics show us, when looking at Gini coefficients, is that income inequality is declining over the globe. However, if we look at income inequality, instead of just taking the aggregate, and that's a problem with a lot of these figures, isn't it? Is that you can take the number in the aggregate, but really you need to break them down and do some analysis in it, because does the aggregate match everything else? You can get differences in here at a smaller level, let's say looking at the UK or looking at the globe, is that you might get completely different statistics that's in it. So, when you're looking at the aggregate, you do need to drill down into them and to think about them in a little bit more detail. And this just takes it down to another level of analysis. As in the first graph on the left, it looks at two measures of inequality. It looks at GDP per capita and it looks at the Gini index. And in the first graph, the blue one on the left-hand side, which is the advanced economies, is that the evidence suggests that income inequality is increasing in high-income countries by both measures. So GDP per capita, which will be going down, and also the Gini index, which will be increasing. Surprisingly, is that when you start to look at the emerging markets or low income and developing countries, is that income inequality is also increasing laterally. So from 2013 onwards, is that there has been an increase in income inequalities in both of those countries too. So for a period of time, the economies were becoming more equitable, but from 2013 onwards, is that there have been increases in inequalities, increases in inequalities on both measures since 2013. In other words, we can look at the aggregate and see that over a period of time, income inequality has declined. But now, from 2013 onwards at least, there has been an uptick, a growth in income inequality across the globe. Now, I mentioned this particular work and this particular scholar, Thomas Piketty, and this is taken from his really staggering piece of statistical analysis, which I'm not advising you to read because it's very dull and it's very long. But what Piketty does is that he's collected statistics of a number of different countries and compares them and looks for various trends. And this is taken from his work, as I say, and this just analyses the Anglo-Saxon world. So this is just the UK, the US, the Canadians, and the Australian markets. And all four tend to a similar kind of distributional issue, in that you have, in the early 20th century, high levels of inequality, which declined substantially after the Second World War, and then grow again after 1980, the period that we've referred to as being the financialized era. And what Piketty's argument is that we are now starting to see evidence of income inequality that was the same as it was back in the early 20th century, which is quite marked, really, because one of the questions that needs to be asked is that if the economy of the globe has grown to the extent that it has done over the last century and a quarter, but income inequality has stayed stable over the same period, who are the beneficiaries? Who are the beneficiaries of economic growth, and why? Why is that, and why and how has that occurred? Because surely the notion economics itself is that if you grow the size of the pie, that each individual slice gets proportionally better, and we all are theoretically better off. Well, Piketty's work suggests that that's not the case, because proportion of the the population have gained more than most, and some have gained considerably less. Not surprisingly, is that those who have gained most are those that were already wealthy, and those that have gained least are those that were already poor. In other words, the poor get poorer and the richer have got richer. What's also interesting, I think, from this graph here, if I can get the... So you've got this... doesn't seem to want to work. Let's try again. There we go. That really needs to be a little bit further over to the right. But between those two lines, between the end of the Second World War and the period of the early 1980s, the Second World War to the financialized era, is that you have a general trajectory of declining income inequality. Now, is it a surprise that this coincides directly with the period that is after Bretton Woods? The Bretton Woods period, which regulates finance. And is it just an accident, a statistical accident, that regulation of finance also coincides with a period which is known as the Golden Age, where economic growth is at its peak? And analysis would need to be done in order to be able to corroborate that. But from my particular perspective, I would say that no, it's not a coincidence at all. Is that once you regulate capital and you put it to its proper purposes, then you get more of an equitable distribution. And then you also get economic growth that can be benefited by the majority rather than a minority. And it's no surprise that since the 1970s, and that a lot of the regulation and restrictions that were set up and established by Bretton Woods have been repealed and done away with under the guise of setting markets free. The more we've set the markets free, and really it's not regulation or deregulation, it's a re-regulation, isn't it? And I'll talk more about this next time, is that whilst we might have deregulated markets and business, we've re-regulated labour, and that labour have become heavily regulated by lots of different legislation that have reduced the rights of trade unions, as an example. And in the US, is that everybody has the right to be a member of a trade union. However, this doesn't stop employers from discriminating against trade unions, even though it's illegal. It still happens. In the UK, trade unions cannot strike unless there is a 50% vote in favour of the strike, not just of those that have voted, but of the whole of the membership. So we've freed up the market and we've regulated labour within it, which strikes me as being a first example of an inequality of opportunity. That's clear then. Right. So that's income inequality. Now let's look at wealth inequality. Wealth inequality is a major economic and social concern, to the extent that the World Economic Forum 2 years ago dedicated itself to looking at wealth inequalities within a wider society. Now, this is the global wealth pyramid from 2018. I've got a dozen of these or so, and they're all the same. But what is quite measured is that the number of people at the top is declining, but the amount of assets that they earn is increasing. And the amount that are at the bottom is also declining, but the amount that they earn is declining also. Within the top, if you just look at that dark blue triangle that's at the top of the pyramid itself, is that you've got 42 million people. That's just 0.8% of the population. This is the working population, by the way. But 42 million people have got assets of over $1 million US dollars, which is a lot of money, isn't it? Or is it? If you think that by the time that you get through to the end of your working life and that you have a property that you've paid for, and that you have some investments and a pension, how far away from a million are you going to be? Well, it depends where your property is, but let's say you're Singaporean, you own a house in Singapore. If you've paid off that mortgage on that house in Singapore, you are a dollar millionaire. And so access to that £1 million or $1 million bracket of assets is not that problematic, but only 42 million people have achieved it. And of course, within that small group of 42 million people is that we could replicate that pyramid within that top pyramid as well, because the real wealth is concentrated in the top 0.1% of the global population, not the 1% of the global population. The billionaires, sorry, it's the 0.01% of our population. It's the billionaires of our society, not the millionaires of our society. Years ago, 40 years ago, becoming a billionaire was something substantial. You could live off $1 million. You can't live off $1 million now. But 42 million people, 0.8% of the population, own 44%, 45% of the world's wealth, which is astronomical. The bottom group, which is 3.2, excuse me a minute, is 3.2 billion people have got assets of less than $10,000, which is a bit of a lie, actually, because the majority of people, there's got to be a cutoff point that's in here, but actually the majority of that 3.2 billion people have no assets at all. And the amount of the total assets that is actually in that particular section is 1.9% of the global assets. So in other words, wealth is more heavily distributed towards the top. It's inequitable. Now this really begs the question about, well, when you take into consideration chief executive incomes at 320 times median incomes, and you talk about the distribution of wealth to the top 1% of the population, you say, well, it's a natural consequence, isn't it? Nobody said the world was fair. Nobody said it was equitable. Even within theoretically utopian designs of economic systems such as socialism and communism, there's always some that have slightly more than others or will have more than others. In practice, it's just as inequitable as any other kind of an economic system. But is the existence of billionaires, is that an aberration of our system? Is that an indication that the system has succeeded, or is that an indication that the system fails miserably? Does the fact that chief executives earn 320 times more than average workers, is that really an indication of the value that is generated by each and every one of them? In other words, is the differential too much? And where should the differential be set? And these are more moral and ethical concepts and ideas, which I'll talk more about in next week's lecture. But at the moment, what I want you to do is to think about these things, not just in terms of their absolutes, but also in terms of the justifications for them. Is that why is it acceptable for there to be billionaires? And in Bezos and Musk's case, multiple billionaires. Why is it acceptable that is possible? Why is it acceptable that chief executives should earn 320 times median income? Or indeed, is it not acceptable? And if it is, who says it's acceptable? And if it isn't, who says it isn't? Moving on into our financialized world is that financial wealth, nominal wealth, has grown much more than productive wealth, nominal capital. So they should necessarily correspond with each other, until what you do get is that you start to get the assets that move very much they differentially increase away from productive capital, and that's the difference that's here. Wealth against capital, wealth being assets, capital being productive capital, plant, and so on and so forth. And there's a substantial differential, and it starts to shift rapidly from the early 1980s. In that globally is that the ownership of assets returns more wealth than the ownership of productive capacity. Out of interest, do I think that something like Bretton Woods Agreement should be introduced in order to reduce income inequality? I would say yes. However, I am a realist, and I don't think there's any chance in hell that that's going to happen. Is that who would establish it? The only way that something like that is ever likely to be established is if the global superpowers get together and agree upon it. Well, at the moment, they can't agree upon how we're not going to stave away the global warming and climate change and so on and so forth. And other parts of the global infrastructure, like the IMF and the World Bank, look completely toothless in the face of things. It took something like the Second World War in order to be able to establish some kind of global consensus. And as we move closer and closer towards climate change, or the impacts of climate change, maybe that might instigate some kind of global consensus about the way that we should manage, the way that we should organize our economies. An interesting question. Oh, there's another one up here. What did I do before I was a lecturer? I'll answer at the end if you're still interested. And as we've said already, is that the share of the top wealth in share of financial assets is growing up, is increasing. It's a particularly boring chart, this one, because the amount of assets that are held by the top 10%, which is the turquoisey greeny line at the top, is slightly declining. But really, it's the grey line at the bottom, which is the top 1% increase. So that's that pyramid within inside that pyramid, is that the top 10% of wealth earners are being compressed just as much as everybody else. But there is a gradual and an increasing funneling of more and more assets and more and more wealth to the top 1%, or the top 0.1%, really. The billionaires of our economy and our society. And this chart depicts numbers of, or the generation of billionaires, which are in the stacked columns. So the brown part of the column is the United States. The lighter brown, the tan one, is Europe, and the grey area is Asia. And there are proportionately more billionaires being generated out of China than there are in other parts of the globe. In total numbers, the majority of them are in the US, but China is producing more quicker than the US currently, which is a bit of an aberration of its own system, isn't it? Because that's supposedly a market-based, socialized system where there should be more equitable outcomes. But in effect, that doesn't seem to be the case. And that would sort of corroborate my point that I made earlier on, in that China just looks like a financialized economy, just like many of the other economies of the world. So what's also interesting here is that you look at the black line, which is the emerging markets or global markets index. And as the global market index collapsed in the global financial crisis, it quickly recovered. Now, one of the things that we know is that stock markets are very much dependent upon flows of income, or flows of capital. And the people that have got the flows of capital are the wealthiest. Now, the number of billionaires went down after the global financial crisis, but quickly recovered, which means that there are more people with more money in order to be able to invest in stock markets. Stock markets took a hit and a dip, and then they carry on. If you think about it, is that if you're a billionaire And let's say you lose 10% of your wealth. So you lose 10% of your wealth, which would be 100 million, which is a dramatic amount of money. But nevertheless, you've still got 900 million left. I think you'll be all right. And what do they do with the 900 million? And higher incomes, higher income earners and people with high levels of wealth. Well, there's only so much that you can spend. So if you don't spend it, it wouldn't be prudent to just save it, would it? To leave it in a bank account or put it in a big box under the bed. Money, it'd have to be a big box and a big bed and a big bedroom to get that kind of money in it. So wealthy people are surrounded by other people, intermediaries, financial intermediaries, that make money, fees, out of investing other people's money. So instead of just sitting on all of that cash, why not invest it? And as a consequence is that, by and large, stock markets are held by, over 50% of all stock markets are held by the top 1% of the population. And when you look at household wealth by different quintiles, is one of the things that is apparent is the greater proportion of financial assets that are held by those that are in the top part of the wealth and income distribution. So the wealthier you get, the more and more assets that you're holding, which are financial assets. Of course, there's going to be lots of non-financial assets as well, because people can buy them, they can afford to buy them. So there'll be non-financial assets such as art, perhaps, or cars or other things that maybe people are owning as assets. And there will be productive assets as well that's within there. But there is an increasing proportion which is just dedicated towards financial assets. And if the wealthiest are investing more and more of their incomes and their wealth, the equity on more financial assets, then we know that the value of the financial assets will go up, which will mean that more people will invest in financial assets. But it's not equal to everybody, is that you need to have money beyond what you spend in order to be able to live. And I think that one of the headers one of the slides that I missed out so far was about the number of people within the US. I think it's 80% of all people within the US live paycheck to paycheck. In other words, you get paid and then you spend it all. And by the time that you get paid again in a month, there's nothing left. Now, if that's the way that people live, and that will be through necessity rather than design, is that there is no spare in order to be able to invest into savings and so on and so forth. So the system itself limits opportunity, because the beneficiaries of the system of investments can only be those that have got the money that's available to invest in them in the first place. And I think this is an interesting thing, is that should therefore in terms of financial deepening, is that should it be that those people that live paycheck to paycheck should be able to borrow money, but to do what exactly? Because whatever that they are doing with their money needs to be able to pay at least a return back upon being able to pay off their debts in the first place, which is exactly what Minsky describes as Ponzi financing. That's when you start to get bubbles, and that's when you start to get financial crisis. So it's a problematical conundrum. It's a challenge to resolve. The pandemic, of course, made things worse. Is that billionaire wealth surged by 70%, or 2.1 trillion during the pandemic. So billionaires, US billionaires, are now worth combined $5 trillion. And that actually is approximately 60% of the proposed American Democrat Build Back Better program. In other words, the Build Back Better program can be financed by a few number of billionaires that exist in American society who did very well out of the pandemic. And they are, to a greater extent, the tech billionaires, the Bezoses, Musk, Zuckerbergs, so on and so on and so forth. So what we've seen here is that over time, wealth increases. Flows of investment coupled with increased liquidity and the size of the financial sector ensures this. If provision is therefore made for you widen you democratize finance or you deepen finance, is that there therefore is a challenge in terms of who and why are taking out financing in order to be able to invest, which is not being invested out of savings. And that leads to this Minsky moment, this Ponzi finance that Minsky talks about. Yeah, and the inevitability of financial collapse or financial crisis or bubbles on financial crisis. Whilst bubbles and asset price correction exists, the general trajectory is always upwards, is that you might well have a price correction, but the residual amount of income and wealth that is left over is sufficient in order to reflate the assets and to continue to build them forward. House prices, as an example, do not mirror the house prices of the 1970s. Yes, there have been house price corrections, and then they've consolidated and they've grown, and they've consolidated and they've grown, and they've consolidated and they've grown. In that, for the majority of people, the biggest asset that they will invest in will be their house, not their pension. In that, historically, the house pays more of a return than people's pensions, particularly as we've shifted away from a defined benefit pension, where people knew what they were going to get once their pension matured, into now a defined contribution pension, which you know how much you're paying every month into your pension, but you've no idea what you get back at the end of it. So the general trajectory of wealth and income supports Minsky's analysis, and Minsky's analysis of the natural consequence of bubbles and crisis. But that doesn't stop the general trajectory of asset prices going up, because there is enough income and wealth which is being complemented and is being accelerated through the current conjuncture of low interest rates and high liquidity provision by the banking sector. Who are they lending to? Wealth is determined by savings and inheritance. If you are living paycheck to paycheck, you don't save anything. But inheritance is a big contributor towards people's wealth. It's passed on from generations to generations to generations. There's nothing wrong with that, by the way, is that most people will have paid taxation on their assets. Not everybody will do because of tax avoidance policies. And that's a different thing, and that's something we'll talk about next time as well. As an example of rentier income, somebody that invested in the S&P 500 with £1,000 or $1,000, that should say not and 1,000, it should say $1,000. In 1978, it would now be worth 31 times that. So $1,000 invested in 1978 would now be worth $31,000. The richest 1% own all of the stock in stock markets. Example of rentier income. Furthermore, as opportunity is not equitable because the beneficiaries of investments are those that have the money to invest in. There are also other structural issues about equitable distributions. As an example, a woman earns 32 cents to the dollar that is earned by a man. This is in the US again. So on average, women earn a third of what men earn. And it's even more accelerated or exaggerated if one compares race. is that a black household would earn 13 cents to a dollar that's earned in a white household. So there are structural inequalities which predicate people not being able to take in access or gain access to markets and so on and so forth. And it's also worth considering is that where deliberate policies have been enacted in order to be able to democratize finance, i.e. give people mortgages and enter into the mortgage market, that didn't work out well either, did it? And who were the ones that benefited least from or suffered most from those house price corrections? So leaving behind income and wealth inequality, I want to now talk about what's referred to as the digital divide, which is a very consequential part of income or equality of opportunity. As an example of the digital divide, my parents are quite elderly and don't really do the internet and computers or anything like that, which means that they don't get the best prices for things like insurances or utilities. Somebody has to do it for them. And that is a way in which we have discriminated against people. But access to ICTs, computers, the internet, is not equitable. Not everybody has got broadband or fiber. Not everybody has got access to the best computers. Not everybody can afford a smartphone and a smartphone contract. The access to ICTs, therefore, are not equitable through age, gender, and lots of different dynamics that impact upon the inequalities of opportunity. And in a study by Christian Fuchs, who's a very interesting writer on technology, actually, suggests that the contributors to the digital divide are multiple and complex, as I just said earlier. Whilst technology may be ubiquitous, access to it is limited by age, gender, income, geography, and by technology itself. In that technology reinvents itself and leaves behind a legacy of technology that doesn't work anymore. If you remember way back on lecture 1 or 2, I told you I have an iPhone 3GS, which works perfectly well, apart from the fact that it's not supported by Apple. Is that technology firms build in planned redundancies of the technology. Otherwise, why would we buy more MacBooks, Apple Macs, iPhones, Apple Watches, and so on and so forth? And of course, Samsungs, etc., etc., etc. Technology itself is a limitation. Technology itself is a limitation in that, how does it work? Exactly. Every generation of technology requires you to be slightly more astute about how that technology works and how you can best make it work. As an example, my wife bought a MacBook Air for her music studies, but then she said, where do I plug my USB in? So there's no USB in a MacBook, darling. Well, how do you copy files then? You do it on the cloud or but technology has moved beyond the user. This technology is driven by people that are very excited about technology. And sometimes do they leave behind the people that are going to use it, the bulk of the people that are going to use it? Do you reach peak technology? So at my age, you go, that's it, I've had enough of technology, that's it, I'm stable now with what I've got. I don't need to, my utilization and acceptance of technology can stop now. I don't need any more. I've got everything that I need technologically. I'm good. Leave me alone. Is that a thing? I don't know. There's a correspondence between global inequality and increases in the digital divide. In other words, access to technology is, for the most part, is for the wealthiest members of our society and the wealthiest parts of the globe. So this seems to limit claims of what's referred to as techno-optimism. And of course, the biggest exponents of techno-optimism are the tech businesses, who would maintain in their visions and their missions in that what they're doing is that they're bringing everybody together to make the world a better place, and all of the world's solutions, all the world's problems can be resolved by greater access to technology, more data, data analysis, and then the next subsequent levels of technology. It's an extraordinarily deterministic but optimistic view of the world of technology, without the consideration at all of the Beck's perspective of the downsides or the possible negatives that may come as a consequence of the introductions of different levels of technologies. And as a consequence is that if societal problems still occur, is then the technological deterministic view of tech firms and technological optimists are undermined. Because as we know, the digital divide is much more complex, and a much more complex array of factors that are brought into the, as it says on the slide, gender, age, income, geography, etc., etc., etc. A reliance upon an optimistic view of technological determinism seems to me to be somewhat naive at best. That seems to have stimulated some questions, so let's have a look at those. No, there's no break today. No questions, there's no break. We're going right the way through. Do you want a break? It's 1 o'clock. Do you want a break? I'm asking you. Not really. Right, I'll crack on then. There's probably only about 20 minutes to go, to be honest. So, so digital divide is just is an example of, and a really important example of, inequality of opportunity. If the opportunity is, how do you get a job? How will you get jobs when you leave university? You'll probably do it via the internet, through job searching, through networking, and so on and so forth. If you don't have the access to the machinery, the software and the hardware, because you are already from an unequal background, is that your life opportunities are already limited. And it's worth pointing out is that once you say, well, this strikes me as being a bit ludicrous, Paul, everybody's got the access to the internet. And I think you need to be aware of the fact is, and I'm not saying this from a bad thing, but you are a member of the global elite. I know it might not feel like it now, but you are. You will have come from relatively well-to-do backgrounds. You will have been given access to schooling and to books and to a safe environment and to nutrition and so on, and security. And that is not the life story of the majority of the globe. You will become probably within the top 15% of income earners on the planet within about 5 to 10 years of you starting your employment, which is quite salutary. There's nothing wrong with it. I'm not criticizing anybody as a consequence. The next move in techno-optimism is what's been referred to as techno-narcissism. Would argue that digitization of society and the economy has presented more inequalities than previous existed. I think it's an argument, Liam. I think it is a very distinct, I think what it's done is it's shifted the locus of where inequalities come from. In the, let's say, back in the 18th century or the 19th century, is that inequalities would have come from where you were born, and also your capacity to access schooling and your ability to be able to do manual labor. Now we've added the digital element into it, into another aspect of it that didn't exist. So I don't think it displaces any of the ones that I talked about earlier on, but I think it adds another element that is potentially a source of inequality for quite considerable parts of the globe, people in the globe. So techno-narcissism is an extension of the techno-optimism and really refers to the firms, tech firms themselves. I'm not going to attempt to say that guy's name because I can't, but it's Sri Lankan. But he suggests that techno-optimism obscures the issue as it's big tech itself that enhances the problem. Big tech and their narratives are part of the problem. The roots of big tech is a belief, almost an ideology, that problems are resolved through data and technology, and they are providers of the solutions. Witness example, Google Books, where they just copied without permission people's books, even though they were copyrighted. Because the narrative says, well, it's in everybody's interest that people have got access to books. Well, you can't deny that, but it's very naive. But they're seeing that they're providing a solution, not that we're resolving a problem. So it negates, because they're so positive about the power of the digital technology, it negates the view. I mean, listen to the narratives about Zuckerberg and Meta. I don't know, to some people, the idea of a meta universe or a metaverse might sound very exciting. It sounds awful to me. It sounds like the Matrix. But nevertheless, it's all presented in a uniquely optimistic way. Negates the view that they may contribute to any of the potential problems that exist. Social media addictions, the amount of time people spend actually online doing what exactly? And it's techno-narcissism, because narcissism is a particular psychological trait. A narcissist sees the world through only their own prism of their own experiences. But really, narcissism in its truest extent is about an expression of love. Yeah, the world loves me and it looks how I need it to look. In other words, the world is just a perfect reflection of myself and I can love it. It loves me. It's narcissism. Techno-narcissists see the world through their own lenses and don't appreciate what may exist outside of those particular lenses. And it's Beck and Beck's work that reminds us that this is not as gilded as it might, or as utopian as it might seem. Cybercrime, cybersecurity, cryptocurrencies and money laundering, international crime is exaggerated and exacerbated by the digital environment. Fake news, false news, alternative facts, polarizations occur through social media, out of which the majority of social media platforms, Facebook in particular, seek to absolve themselves of any responsibility of that. So, well, we didn't put it up there. We're just a platform. We're not a publisher. It's not down to us to actually censor people's opinions and work. But of course, the algorithms do it for you, in that the algorithms will filter stuff that you've seen before towards you, which therefore has an impact upon the way that people think and the way that people consider alternatives and the potential for alternatives. You don't get wholesale acceptance of a cult such as QAnon without some kind of help. So techno-narcissists ignore things like redundancy, technological redundancy. They ignore things like the cost of buying the stuff in the first place. They ignore arguments that are overtly complex and that are made more complex by a lack of opacity, a lack of transparency. Do we know what data is held about us and what that data is being used for? Do we know what the algorithm does and how the algorithms allocate various feeds to us? And they exaggerate utopian claims against potentially dystopian realities. Within a narcissistic world, they just don't exist. Mass media critiques are infected by the premise that it's uncritical of the narratives peddled by the corporations. In other words, manufacturing consent and the business media and the business elites all settle behind the notion that digital technologies and technology is exactly what is required in more measures in order to be able to make things more efficient and to resolve the particular problems that we face now, despite the fact that some of the problems that have been faced now are as a consequence of the digital technologies or a technological advance in the first place. Narratives to the contrary are almost ridiculed as being a Luddite fantasy or a fallacy, or even just blind acceptance. So, well, it's what it is, isn't it? So you just have to get on with it. That's an uncritical way of seeing something, which is actually really, really quite potent. Notwithstanding, the other argument is that why should the power of technological advance in something as potent as digital technologies be the purview of maybe half a dozen extraordinarily large corporations? I think Yanis Varoufakis is going to write a book, which will probably come out next year, and it's going to be called Techno-Feudalism. And he was just replicating the same arguments that I've just talked about here. But it'll be an interesting book when it comes out, and it will be kind of like a shame that you won't be doing this lecture series next year, because there'll be a bit of his book in it. It's a bit philosophical, but is it good that it gets us to question whether the advancement of technology has in real terms improved opportunity? Exactly, Liam. That is exactly what I'm asking you to do. Yeah. So for those of you that feel like doing the technology increases financial deepening and removes income inequality, is that depth of analysis will be something that would give you a very high grade on that particular paper. So let's return to Piketty briefly. I think I've covered most of this. Is that wealth inequalities and income inequalities increase as a consequence of the return on assets is larger than the returns that are made on investment. It's G or I, it's used interchangeably. But interestingly, in his new book, which is the chapter that I've asked you to read for the exam, and I do genuinely would like you to read the first 10 pages of Piketty's introduction, because it's marvelous. Because within it, he explains that each period creates a narrative, which he describes as an ideology that both explains and justifies inequality. And in the modern era, the modern conjuncture, he suggests that the narratives that explains and justifies inequality is orientated around three particular areas: property, access to property, and owning property. Entrepreneurship, you're either entrepreneurial or you're not. If you are entrepreneurial, you'll be successful, which actually is not strictly true, because there are lots of entrepreneurs out there that don't make much money at all. The businesses die within weeks or months or years. And then one that I really want to talk about now, because Piketty discusses the others in his book, is about meritocracy, is that we live in a meritocracy, don't we? So in other words, is that your ability to succeed is based upon your own abilities and your own skills. Well, the flip side of that is that if you struggle, if you are one of the 80% that's living from paycheck to paycheck, it's your fault. You haven't utilized the assets and the abilities that were God-given to you, or you didn't have any in the first place. Whichever, if you didn't have them, it's still your fault, but it's your fault because it's a meritocracy. People that work hard, people that have got the best ideas, people that do get up at 5 a.m, you know, you see all the, I don't know, that rise to the grind, that get up and grind their way through life for hours and work hard and so on and so forth. They're the winners of a global meritocracy. But let's have a look at that. Meritocracy as a word is relatively new. First appeared in an article written by Alan Fox in a socialist journal, believe it or not, but not in glowing terms that it's now part of the neoliberal justification for inequalities. And what Fox writes is, this way lies the meritocracy, the society within which the gifted, the smart, the energetic, the ambitious, and the ruthless are carefully sifted out and helped towards their destined positions of dominance, where they proceed not only to enjoy the fulfillment of exercising their natural endowments, but also to receive a fat bonus thrown in for good measure. That doesn't seem to be the same kind of meritocracy that we're given to acknowledge as being the rationale or the underpinning rationale as to people's successes. So we have to raise questions, therefore, about whether or not we live in a meritocracy. And this chart from a paper by Korak in 2013 plots income inequality as a consequence of the Gini coefficient against levels of social mobility. And social mobility can be measured. And by and large is that the line in the middle goes down. So what Korak is suggesting here is that where there is higher income inequality in a country is that social mobility is reduced. In other words, if you are at the lower end of the income spectrum in a country which has got high levels of income inequality, the meritocratic principle has become rendered negligible. In other words, social mobility is not enhanced at all. Those areas where there are higher levels of social mobility are in places like Denmark, Norway, Finland, Sweden, Japan, Germany, Canada to an extent. All social democratic countries where there is a higher level of income equality. Now, Korak doesn't suggest a causal link, but it says there's a correspondence that's here, and that's worth thinking about, I think. Yeah, there's a typo on the previous slide. You know what I mean. But this also the natural consequence of Korak's work out here is that your income is likely to be strongly correlated to the income that your parents had, depending on the country that you're born in. In other words, it's suggesting that social mobility is a bit of a myth. Not across the globe completely, but in the majority of cases. So let's look at that a little bit further. In a highly marketized system, the poor are disadvantaged. A lack of money means that there is a lack of capacity to buy. And that also includes opportunities. And that could be things like books and ICTs at home. Some time ago, I used to do some reading with people who had designated or had been determined to have lower than average reading levels. And I would just sit and read with them and just enjoy stories and their company, really, but it gave them an opportunity for them to read to somebody else. And one of the things that I learned through talking and working with those people is that they didn't have books at home. And when I was younger, there was always books at home. There was always something to read. But if you think books, think of the ICTs. If you haven't got books, you're only likely to have an ICT available. And including those opportunities that can be bought could also relate to things like preschool education, childcare, schools, universities and colleges, and internships as well. Internships, by and large, are not paid. So if they're not paid, you need to be supported whilst you're doing your internship. Opportunity, therefore, has become another commodity that we buy, and is, for the most part, the jurisdiction of the elites. Even if someone succeeds based upon their merits, and there are cases where people do, don't get me wrong, it's just that they are few and far between in comparison to those that don't, is that happens once. So let's say I benefit as a consequence of my own merits, and I pass that on to my offspring. Well, they didn't benefit. They benefited from my merits, not their own. My merits accrues me wealth, which I pass on to my offspring, and they remain wealthy. They don't necessarily do anything meritorious in order to warrant that. They were lucky in some respect. Merit occurs once. It might well be that somebody is meritorious and then somebody after them comes along which is equally or more so, and so on. So of course that's going to be the case. I mean, you always there's always the justification, oh yes, well of course it's a meritocracy. I know somebody didn't have this, needed that, and now he's worth X, Y, and Z. Yeah, I get that. And I'll come on to that in a minute. But for the most part, we're all accidents of birth. You and me are an accident of where we were born and who we were born into, and the opportunities that were provided to us as an accident of our own birth. So success within existing structures itself is the revolutionary thing. Revolution is not about abolishing the system and replacing it with something which is more meritorious, because there are examples of people that are able to do it. Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, all the other people that have risen to the top. They don't need to be such extreme examples of Bezos and all the rest of them, do they? Be somebody that's within the family that you know, or even maybe even parents that have done particularly well. So that's the revolutionary success. That's the thing that we get behind, the thing that we talk about, the thing that gets extolled. Oh, I know so and so, and if only you work hard enough, you could be the next Jeff Bezos. So the big names among lesser luminaries are advocates of the status quo. They're advocates of the current system. But they're proof of the success of the system too, and therefore are also likely to support the status quo. Why change it? Why resolve it when it works so well? They might argue. But then there is more of a sinister overtone to this, is that if the system works so well and I've risen to the top of it, why bother with things like democracy when order's already been established in a just and a fair way through merit for our meritorious system? Why bother changing it? Inherited wealth provides for a concentration of ever-increasing levels of wealth in smaller and smaller numbers of dynastic families. That one irritated me. As an example, 7 junior members of the Walton family are already billionaires. They have benefited from the largesse of the older generation of the Walton family that set up the Walmart chain. The unelected elite decide which trusts to support and which politicians to fund. Each year, the WF at Davos discuss how the world's richest and most powerful elites can shape the world into a better place. These are the same groups of people that contributed to and benefit from the problem, which is greatly analysed and talked about by a book by Anand Giridharadas, published as a second edition, came out last year, which is an interesting work to look at. But a lot of the global billionaires will fund philanthropic works in the belief that they're better at doing it than governments are at spending their tax dollars. And it's a justification for not paying tax. Well, I'm much more effective at supporting certain philanthropic aims rather than paying my tax. And as I think I've already mentioned to you, of course, in the US, is if you're funding or if you are paying money into a philanthropic 501c3 company, is that you can subtract those donations away from your tax bills. So as I said earlier on, social mobility is contingent upon where you were born. And these are the highest countries with the highest levels of social mobility in the globe. Strangely enough, the US and the UK are not part of it. So that we need to think about finance then, democratizing finance. Expanding access to formal credit institutions for poor and marginalized segments of the populations. That's what we mean by democratizing finance. The opening up of savings accounts and investment opportunities for those who lack savings to invest. It's politically ambiguous. Extending credit or investment opportunities to the poor could be a project of egalitarian reform or a cover for new forms of exploitation, like Wonga Capital, where people would take out payday loans but would end up paying an interest rate of some 2,000%, or a complicated combination that benefits some and hurts others. It's Beck's perspective entirely. As an example of this, the initial project in microlending carried out by the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh appeared to empower women in rural areas of that nation. But the Grameen Bank was required to monetize its investments, and subsequent newer for higher levels of returns and profit versions of microlending.
Sorry, your slides.
Predatory and have entrapped low-income borrowers in an endless cycle of borrowing. Sorry, who wanted to ask a question then?
Your slides disappeared, sir.
Yeah, you're not sharing your screen anymore.
There you go. Is that it?
Yeah,
Yes,
it's back on now.
Thank you. So I won't go through that. I mean, I think it's there. It's fairly straightforward. So what I did is I gave an example of something that was set up with great intentions to be able to democratize finance, the Grameen Bank, but pressures of business to monetize the whole thing meant that it became predatory. And there are other examples of predatory financing that occurs because those that are least able to afford to pay for things are the highest risk, and therefore that our logic would be that they occur the highest return, the highest levels of risk, and therefore the highest levels of interest rates that's payable on them. So financial deepening, democratization, is seen as a good thing. The more people have access to markets and finance, and the more efficient markets can become, and the more people therefore enjoy the benefits. There's a kind of like a tautologist argument around if everybody's got access to the markets themselves become more efficient, and as a consequence of that, people benefit from the markets themselves. But one of the things that we need to consider here is that, is every loan always granted? Are all requests for credit always acknowledged? Do people always get the amount of money that they want to borrow? And of course, that's not the case, is it? Is that credit, loans, is always rationed, and it's rationed by the banking sector on the basis of whether or not they believe that they will get their money back. Well, on that basis, who are they likely to lend to, and who are they not likely to lend to? According to Immanuel Wallerstein, finance is a system of inequalities which works culturally and politically through plausible rhetorics and attractive visions which enlist supporters and seduce opponents. In other words, finance is particularly adept at creating narratives which actually extol the values of it, hide the potential downsides of it. Cryptocurrencies and markets, everybody wins, the market's going up. But of course, that's not the case, is it? We create an attractive visions, which enlist supporters. And then as more people support it, then more people will look at those narratives and say, well, they're making money on X, Y, and Z. Should we do that too? Remember, going back to one of the other lectures that we talked about in Minsky's lecture. And it's seductive. Finance itself is seductive. The dominant financialized narrative substitutes for collective politics of social security, collective politics where we're better off working together, and actually strips out the individual. Says it's down to the individual and their merits. And as a consequence, there exists a marked discrepancy between promises and outcomes. We've already talked about predatory lending, Wonga and other payday loan lenders. But there are other less obvious examples, things like endowment mortgages. An endowment mortgage would be that you would take out a mortgage for 30 years, but you would invest into a life insurance scheme. And then after the 30 years is that the life insurance scheme would have accrued enough money in order to pay off your mortgage. That was the theory. Of course, it never worked. Personal pensions is that personal pensions are supposed to pay you sufficient amounts of money in order to be able to complement the state pension so that you can live comfortably. Well, there's been a marked shift away from defined contribution schemes to defined benefit, from defined benefit to defined contribution schemes, to the extent that personal pensions are always under pressure in order to be devalued. And you'll be well aware that the university faculty have decided to strike, or did strike last week for 3 days, because of the potential revaluation of pension schemes, which would mean that the pension schemes were revalued at 35% less than they were initially, which means that you've lost a considerable amount of potential income. Payment protection insurances, where people were asked if they would like to take out payment protection insurances on purchases. Well, it soon became readily apparent that actually the firms were making more money on PPI than they were doing selling the white goods, the washing machines, the televisions in the first place. So in the end, they stopped asking them, and they just bundled it all into the overall credit deal and said, just sign it. And people were not aware of the fact that they were paying for payment protection insurances that are in there, which passes the risk entirely on to the consumer. And also the derivatives that led into the global financial crisis is that we've secured mortgages, we've made the whole thing AAA rated, we've eliminated risk until we didn't. And there's a problem that need to be overcome in order for democratization, deepening of finance to be more readily established. Firstly, there needs to be predictability of income and wealth effects over the life cycle of individuals and householders. That is getting increasingly more difficult because of short-term contracts, the precariat notion. It's difficult to be able to predict people's incomes. If you can't predict your incomes, it's difficult to know how much you can save and therefore be able to invest. There also needs to be a basic level of consumer financial literacy, and that is missing. The impact of money on the economy is is missing almost exclusively from undergraduate microeconomics. And it's only through courses like this and others like it that you get some kind of like rudimentary understanding about the way that finance impacts upon the real world. Greater literacy in terms of compound interest rates and those sorts of things are essential before people can make legitimate investments or can think about how they can afford to pay the coupons that will be required. And there also need to be financial services and products where risks and returns are calculable. And of course, we're well aware, because of Keynes's conceptualization of uncertainty, is that the future is not known. And those three factors limit the possibilities of widespread financial deepening, because the risk is substantial for those that decide to embark upon it, because they're the most vulnerable members of our society, and that's a challenge. Simply put, the claims of finance are not backed up in empirical reality. And that's some readings that I've just used during the course of the lecture that you can go back and have a look at